Welcome everyone to the Golden Pathway Zoom seminars, which are seminars we put together to help people from the 7 major world religions make the transition into the teachings of the Ascended Masters. We are delighted today to be looking at the ancient mystical origins of Holy Communion. Did you ever wonder what the ancient and mystical origins of Holy Communion are? Where did this sacrament come from? Often we participate in receiving communion. However, the spiritual understanding of the event escapes our outer awareness. So on the inner we may know. In this session, we'll discuss Melchizedek, who brought forth bread and wine when he blessed our father Abraham. Melchizedek, Abraham, and Lot were all present for this sacrament. Why these 3 men? We'll explore those circumstances, and you're invited to join us on this spiritual discovery, and we are very glad to have you with us today. And we are even more delighted to have our beloved previous president, Reverend Kate Gordon, who was born in the United States, raised in the West Indies, spent many years as a registered nurse in the operating room, emergency room, and clinical environments. She's lived all over the world in Germany and organized and traveled with groups of international people in Eastern and Western Europe, Africa, Russia, and parts of the Middle East, including Israel. Kate found the teachings of the Ascended Masters in 1987 and shortly thereafter became a minister in the Church Universal and Triumphant. She was on staff for the Summit Lighthouse for almost 14 years and was co-president of the organization for 10. She is married with 3 adult children, 6 grandchildren, and currently lives in Montana. We are delighted to have you with us, Kate. Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you for everybody that's come on this evening. I know this is a precious time of the week. It's called preparation for the rest of the week. And so your attendance here is very much appreciated.
This is all part of our series on practical spirituality. How do we bring the things that we are learning out of our heads and into our hands and our behaviors so that we are more able to be aware of and appreciate those things which we are receiving on a day-to-day basis, and hopefully behave somewhat differently because we are being brought up higher and getting more light, more understanding and illumination.
Thank you. So I'd like to begin by sharing with you that tonight we're going to speed through 3 stories, 2 of them from the Old Testament, 1 from the New Testament, and we will tie them all together to look at the ancient history of this incredible ritual and sacrament of Holy Communion. The elements are the bread and the wine, and one single word for those 2 elements is the Eucharist. So we celebrate the sacrament of communion every Sunday and often in other services during our conferences and other times during the year. Communion is one of the sacraments that we partake in many, many times in our lifetime. The word sacrament comes from the word sacred. A sacrament is a thing of mysterious and sacred significance. It is a sacred mystery. Through the messengers and the Ascended Masters, God has given us a spiritual path of initiation. And the sacraments are holy events or celebrations that commemorate the steps and stages on the initiatic path. Each and every holy event or sacrament is intended to become a way of life. Thus, each sacrament leads the soul towards oneness with God in the, in the marriage of the soul to the I Am presence. Communion means coming into union. And it's coming into union with the Christ mind. It is putting on the spiritual essence of the body and the blood of Christ. In the partaking of the Christ consciousness through communion, every time we receive it, you receive a tiny increment, bit by bit, of the consciousness of the Christ flame. We also know that Holy Communion is also called the Eucharist, as I said before, and Eucharist simply means thanksgiving. We can go to the next slide, please. The ritual of communion has passed through a very long transformation. It's profoundly symbolic, and it has evolved literally over 4,000 years that we know of. And then there's the history before we know of what happened. There's a profound connection between the Old Testament story of Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and the Passover and the Last Supper, which we will rediscover as we look at the cultural and religious origin of the ritual of communion. The sacrament of Holy Communion, which we have on the next slide, as we know it today, was instituted by Jesus at the Last Supper, where he and the apostles were celebrating the feast of the unleavened bread, or the Passover. You can read about this in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In this sacrament, we have the blessing of the bread and the wine, which is an ancient Jewish tradition, which commemorates the Sabbath and other holy days. It's a ritual which can be traced back even to the story of Melchizedek in the Old Testament, found in the first book of the Old Testament in Genesis. And he is the one who brought forth the bread and the wine when he gave it and shared it with Abraham. What does that mean? He brought it forth. Today we're going to take a closer look at this story because there are 3 men involved, 3 men that you know of today. The priest king and the 2 men who received this auspicious gift of the bread and the wine were the first in the physical plane to receive this gift. For you see, this gift is practiced in the retreats of the Great White Brotherhood throughout systems of worlds. It had not yet been brought into the physical for those wearing bodies to be able to enjoy. Genesis was written by Moses some 645 years after the fact. It's not clear how he received this information. The source is still being debated. Today's story of bringing forth communion from the retreats of the Great White Brotherhood by a high priest king took place somewhere around 2100 BC, making this story over 4,000 years old. The main setting for our story is the central hill country in the land of Cana. It's not far from the place we know today as Jerusalem. This is the land promised to Abraham and to his seed by God. There are 3 main characters involved in this story of old. We take a look at who this group of 3 men were and how, through the hand of God, they came together to be in one place at one time for an event that would bless the earth for thousands of years to come. The first up of these 3 gentlemen was Abraham. Abraham was known as Abram until a later portion of his life. But for the clarity in telling this story, I'm just going to call him Abraham. His name in Hebrew means Father is exalted. He was the first patriarch or father figure that we learn about in the Old Testament. It's interesting to know that he's considered the father of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim religions. Abraham moved slowly and deliberately under the direction of the Lord across the Near East world of 4,000 years ago. He was on foot. He had with him Lot, who was his brother's son. He had with him his wife, who was then called Sarai, and later on she would be called Sarah. And Abraham also had his father with him. On foot, he moved from Mesopotamia, or better known to some of us as Ur of the Chaldees, to Canaan, to Egypt, and back to Canaan. The book of Genesis describes him as a man rich in flocks and herds, who commands a private army and is recognized by neighboring chieftains as a mighty prince. The Bible first depicts Abraham and his family as citizens of the great city of Ur of Chaldees, the flourishing cultural, political, economic center of the literate and technological world of their time. Abraham is the prototype of a man who holds strong to his faith in the Lord's repeated promise that he will be a father of many nations, even when outer circumstances seem to indicate the exact opposite. The next slide. Abraham was a Chela on the path at the time. He had many lifetimes to live. In fact, it was almost 4,000 years later that he made his ascension. As Abraham, he was being tested in his obedience, his faith, his leadership, his dependability, strength, and courage, all qualities of a future ascended master. As El Moria, he was and is the guru and the teacher of our messengers, our teachers, Mark and Elizabeth Clare Prophet. Ascended Master El Moria represents the godly attributes of courage, certainty, power, forthrightness, self-reliance, dependability, faith, and initiatives. These are the qualities of the Father principle. As Abraham, he was the archetype of a man of faith. He lived about 2,100 years BC and ascended in 1898. Next on the list of characters, we have Lot. Lot was related to Abraham. When Abraham's brother died, Lot was entrusted to Abraham. So Lot traveled with him across the many miles to Canaan. Abraham and Lot prospered greatly together. They were both considered rich men in their day. Next slide, please. Lanello, our beloved Lanello, lived as Lot, Abraham's nephew in the 20th century BC, the man of God, in the wretched city of Sodom. As the Ascended Master Lanello, he continues to direct the activities of the Summit Lighthouse and the organization his guru, El Moria, founded. So here we have another repeated relationship between guru and Chela. Lanello is the ever-present guru who has said, ours must be a message of infinite love, and we must demonstrate that love to the world. Whether or not Abraham or Lot knew it, they were ascended masters in the making. Like us, they had knotty problems and difficult karmic circumstances to overcome. They are truly not far removed from us. The masters teach us that we are all Chelas in the becoming. Abraham and Lot were also chelas in the becoming. Arlinello participated in life 2,100 years ago and appeared many times until his ascension in 1973. And the third character. This is an astounding character. When you hear his profile, you will begin to put together why God chose these three men. And I ask you a question to think about while I finish this particular story. If you had a gift to give the earth, something that you knew would be a blessing for God only knows how long, at least 4,000 years now and into the unknown future, who would you choose to bring forth that gift? Let me read the profile of Melchizedek, and you will begin to understand the significance of communion. Melchizedek was the king of Salem, whose name Melchizedek in Hebrew means king of righteousness. He is also referred to the king of Salem. King, the word itself, is the key to the incarnation of God. Melchizedek, priest of the Most High God, is an ancient member of the sacred fire priesthood that we know as the Order of Melchizedek. The Melchizedekian priesthood is very ancient, going all the way back to other systems of stars. Think about that. Other systems of stars. It is the priesthood of the seventh ray, combining perfect religion and perfect science. Priests of this orders are required to be scientists as well as priests who to perfect the way of the light of God in their temples, study unceasingly. Archangel Michael teaches of the Maxim light. This is the great light born by the great ones, such as Melchizedek. And it was that light that blazed upon the altar in the great central temple of Atlantis. Melchizedek is described in the following passage of Hebrews as an immortal, like an ascended master. I'm going to read you that description. It's in Hebrews chapter 7, verses 1 through 3. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave 10th part of all, first being by interpretation of king of righteousness, and after that also king of Salem, which is the king of peace. Listen carefully to this quote directly out of the Bible. Without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth the priest continually. Now, Lord Ling gave us a teaching on how this can be. How can there be a man of God who is wearing a body and was not conceived in the physical and given birth through his physical mother? This is a very, very interesting teaching. Lord Ling, who is God happiness, and who is Moses, who is in a later embodiment, he explains the description of Melchizedek and quote, "But it is written that in due course of time, by the power of the spoken word, released from the throat chakra, spiritual individuals shall face one another, uttering the sacred words, shall quicken by light rays in the seed power of the proper use of the sex energies and the caduceus action, and produce a living form instantaneously, in the great cosmic light from which steps forth a Son of God in radiant manifestation. In this manner, Melchizedek was born, without father, without mother, without descent, without beginning of days, and without ending. He was without an earthly mother and father, but not without a heavenly.
It's 6 o'clock.
But not without a heavenly Father, Mother, God. Thus I have revealed to you this one of the mighty secrets of the order of Melchizedek. Close quote. He refers to Melchizedek as the greatest initiate and adept of the Old Testament, and this soul ascended at the end of that embodiment. So here we have one of the characters that is involved, who was not conceived and born in the physical. He was conceived and born in the heaven world. And this man was the one chosen to actually carry the elements from the etheric into the physical. We have the next slide, please. Okay, so now on to the short story about how these three guys met up. In the New Testament book of Acts, we learn that Abraham was called by God to leave his country and his people and go to the land that, quote, I will show you. That's what God said to him after telling him he needed to leave. He didn't tell him where he was going. He didn't tell him if it was north, south, east, or west. He said, I will show you. In answer to the call, being completely obedient to the word of the Lord, Abraham left, leaving the Sumerian city of Ur, forsaking the culture and the cults of Mesopotamia at a time when the Sumerian civilization was at its height. The Lord told him to journey to a land that he would show him and promised to make of him a great nation. Can you imagine any one of us listening to this story being told by God to take up your things, leave the country that you know, the place you grew up, the place that you received your education, take your wife, take your nephew, and take your father and go, and not even knowing what way to turn when you left the city gate? So this city of Ur was not a rundown poor city. It wasn't one without modern conveniences of that day. It was a city about the size of Bozeman. The city of Ur was part of the Sumerian culture and was at its height when Abraham was asked to leave. Okay, so let's take a look at the lives of Abraham and Lot before they met Melchizedek. Their lives were filled with initiations. Remember, God chooses his people long in advance. These men were wearing bodies and they were being tested in their obedience. The first leg of the trip was 600 miles long on foot, without cell phones, without GPS, without maps, without a compass, without cars, buses, trains, or planes. These men walked. God told Abraham to leave Ur and go to the place that he would show him. Truly, only a man of pure faith would obey. Let's take a look at the map of his journey. You can see the location of Ur at the bottom right-hand corner next to the red encircled number 1. You see Ur. Today we know it as Iraq. Ur developed during the reign of the Sumerian kings and had been a major city for hundreds of years when Abraham was born. He came out of Ur and journeyed to Haran. You can see up on the top where I put Turkey. We know that area of the world today as Turkey. Here he built an altar to Almighty God, not knowing if he was where he was supposed to be or whether there was more of the journey in front of him. This is the place where his father died. And so when he received a word from God again, telling him to move forward, to go to the place I will show you, he was to leave and take Lot and his wife Sarah with him, not knowing the distance, not knowing the journey. But that part of the world is extremely dangerous. It is very rough and mountainous. It is very dry. It's high desert. That in itself was a 400-mile trip. Again, no electronic equipment to tell him which way to go. He turned and went left and started traveling south. The next slide, please. When they arrived in the land of Canaan, for the first time, the Lord appeared to Abraham again and promised, quote, "Unto thy seed I will give this land." And it is written where Abraham erected an altar to Yahweh and called upon the name of the Lord. This was the third time that God told him that he would be giving him a portion of land, and it would be for him and his seed into the future. But that's all the information he got. Not long after he arrived in Canaan, there was a severe famine. Abraham had to leave. There was no way to feed his family and all those that depended upon him. And so he began to travel south again. During this journey to Egypt, Abraham encountered Egyptians, and he was afraid that the Egyptians would kill him because his wife was such a beautiful woman. Now, the backstory here is somehow the Pharaoh heard about Sarah, and he heard that she was one of the most beautiful women ever born. And so he wanted her as part of his life. And if the king knew that Sarah was married to Abraham, Abraham would have been killed so that she would be a widow and they would feel free to take her. And so Abraham represented Sarah as his sister and allowed the Pharaoh to take her into his household. As a result, the Lord unleashed the plague upon the Pharaoh and his house. When the Egyptian ruler learned the truth, he quickly sent Abraham and Sarah away with all the servants, cattle, and riches Abraham had acquired in Egypt. So when the famine finally lifted, once again, Abraham, Sarah, and Lot returned to Canaan. They took everything they owned. By this time, both Lot and Abraham were very rich and had lots of tents, lots of silver and gold, and many herds of cattle, sheep, camel, and countless items. All the things that it would take to take care of all his servants' families, all of the herdsmen, and all of the different animals they had. You can imagine what a massive move this would have been back to Canaan. Next slide, please. Every story I read about this journey of Abraham, they emphasized there were so many animals There were sheep and cattle and camels and all other kinds of animals. So you can imagine what a massive migration this would have been. So once back in Cana, the herdsmen of Lot and Abraham began to quarrel. You can have the next slide, please. There simply was not enough grazing land or water to maintain the animals, and fights broke out between those who were accountable for the herds. Next slide. It wasn't long into their resettlement in the land of Canaan that Abraham and Lot realized there just wasn't enough resources to allow everyone and all the animals to stay in the same place. Sometimes the bottom line is the testing comes when resources are abundant. Something had to be done. So you can feel testing of Almighty God coming upon this situation. Abraham took Lot to the high spot on the land and showed him the fertile valley to the east and the dry land to the west. Abraham was willing to divide the land in half, giving Lot half for his family, animals, and tents. By custom, Abraham, being the elder, was entitled to the first choice, but he gave that privilege to Lot. Lot looked over the land from his position on high, and he made his choice. He chose the land to the east. He chose the fertile Jordan Valley, which included, unfortunately, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham stayed in the land of Canaan and settled in the Judean hill country near Bethel. The grazing was much poorer, as you can see in these pictures. These are actually photos of the land as it is today. It's still the same. One is green and lush, and the other is pretty barren. But Abraham chose to stay within the land where God's blessing was promised. The Lord told Abraham that all he could see, north, south, east, and west, all that land was to be his, and it will be given to him and to his seed forever. Finally, the promise becomes visible. Lot chose the fertile, well-watered Jordan Valley and pitched his tent near Sodom. He chose based on practical consideration. After all, the grazing looked pretty good. But the rich cities of the plain were in moral decay. Next slide, please. After 13 years of being settled in these new towns, a rebellion broke out. The 4 kings of the cities of the Jordan Plain, where Lot lived, revolted against the northern king's rule. The northern forces overwhelmed the southern kings of the Jordan Plain, driving some of them into the tar pits that were littered all over the valley. Those who escaped fled to the mountains, including the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. Next slide, please. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were then robbed of their goods and provisions, and some of their citizens were also captured. Among the captives was Abraham's nephew, Lot. Next slide, please. Hearing of Lot's capture, Abraham stepped into the role of a military leader and armed 318 of his own trained servants and joined other chieftains in the land to defeat a powerful coalition of kings and rescue Lot. When the war was over, the king of Sodom came before Abraham and asked only for his people to be returned. Abraham gave him everything, except Lot. He would not accept any of the plunder from anyone. You think of this story and you think of the qualities of a man of God, a man of faith. I mean, this guy took 318 of his own people and he was fighting enormous troops. And he just understood that God was behind him. He had the faith that his ranks would be filled in, and they were. Next slide, please. Abraham defeated the rebel kings and their forces. He recovered all the goods and even the captives, including Lot. This is the history behind the next scene we'll see on the slide, where Melchizedek is offering the elements of the Eucharist to the victorious Chila on the path. Now we encircle back to the beginning of this story. It is here that Melchizedek, as a result of the warring of the kings and the rescue of Lot, is first seen in the Bible as the priest of the Most High God, who met and blessed Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings, and to whom Abraham gave a 10th part of the spoils. Melchizedek served Abraham bread and wine, the first record we have of serving of Holy Communion. Remember, Melchizedek is a very key figure of light, a guru of gurus. So keep this story in mind. Who were the three souls that God chose and directed through their lives to come together for this incredible gift coming out of the retreats of the Great White Brotherhood? So who were these guys? There were two Chilas in the making, two souls on the path of Christhood, two souls that would have almost 4,000 more years of returning into embodiment. El Moria embodied as Abraham and Lanello embodied as Lot. And the third of this trio, an unascended master who would ascend at the end of that lifetime. He was the highest initiate in the Old Testament, one who carries the maxim light, is sent to welcome Abraham and celebrate his victories with the first known ritual of communion. This was surely an auspicious moment in the Old Testament. This was not a random happening. It was a story of three ascended masters in the making, being initiated by the Brotherhood in celebration of their victory, an ancient ritual that goes back to other star systems and was and is used in the retreats of the Great White Brotherhood to this hour. This glorious gift was brought forth into the physical octave to celebrate a job well done. And so that is the first piece of this story. We now have a secondary story, two combined, on Holy Communion. We're going to look at the ritual that Jesus enacted at the Last Supper and give new meaning to that ritual and give an understanding of what it was like in that room to be with Jesus and to be with the apostles, where Jesus was understanding one thing and the apostles were understanding something different. Okay, next slide, please. As we learned at the very beginning of this workshop, the ritual of communion has passed through a very long transformation. Its profound symbolism has evolved over 4,000 years. We've learned that there is a connection between the Old Testament story of Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and the Passover and the Last Supper. We will rediscover how these are all connected together. And in the end, when we see the full connection, we will understand communion as it is understood in our organization. The next page, please. It's my hope that you'll enjoy either learning for the first time or simply remembering from a long time ago the tremendous spiritual grace of receiving communion. Let us now begin to examine the story of the Last Supper. Next slide. Communion is celebrated around the world in various religions and spiritual gatherings on special occasions. In some traditions, communion is offered on a regular basis. Yet not all of us have a complete understanding of what we're participating in. And, and are we aware of how we can be used to bless so many through the simple act of receiving communion? To experience the mystery of Holy Communion, which is literally the holiness of our being, come into union with God who waits. The next room, or the next slide. During Easter week, Christians around the world celebrate Holy Thursday, the day of the Last Supper. This evening and night over 2,000 years ago provided to be a pivotal series of hours in Jesus' ministry and mission. Under the instruction of Jesus himself, his apostles Peter and John chose a room for the dinner or the supper that was to be removed from the crowds of the city of Jerusalem. This city was up a flight of steps and down a small alleyway from the main roadway. According to the book of Acts, this house, the residence of Mary, who was the mother of Lanello. So Lanello is involved again. It had a large upper room that could accommodate up to 120 people. And beneath this very room was the tomb of David, who was an embodiment of Jesus. This is a picture of the room itself. I was astounded to see how big it was when I got to walk through it. It easily accommodated the Last Supper. That Thursday evening, while in Jerusalem, Jesus gathered his disciples for a Passover celebration. Part of the celebration was the ritual of the bread and the wine. This celebratory Passover dinner Jesus and his apostles were going to participate in was happening every single year for almost 2,000 years. It was a joyful celebration, a time of great thanksgiving, akin to our present-day Thanksgiving in America. The feast was in commemoration of the time 2,000 years prior when the Israelites were finally freed from the bondage of slavery in Egypt. That night, the Israelites literally went from bondage to freedom. The celebration that Jesus was about to engage in included a special lamb that was to be sacrificed in the temple, roasted and eaten. They were to have unleavened bread, which was prepared for all. So this was a time for fellowship, for dancing, singing, storytelling, and the renewal of old friendships, and most of the time for remembering what God did for their people. His disciples had prepared the meal, and they sat down to celebrate in the traditional fashion. The second Old Testament event that we're going to look at happened 2,000 years prior. So what exactly is Passover, and how is it connected to the Last Supper? And therefore, how is it connected to communion? The Feast of the Passover was instituted in the 13th century before the birth of Christ. The 12 tribes of Israel had been enslaved for over 400 years, since the days of Joseph and the famine of Canaan. God chose Moses, lordling, to go to the Pharaoh and to plead for the release of the slaves. And of course, the Pharaoh refused. Next slide, please. God sent 10 different plagues to change the Pharaoh's mind, but he was stubborn, and he was very covetousness, had great covetousness of the slaves and all the work and the beauty they could bring forth for him and his people to enjoy. So the first plague, the rivers turned to blood. The second, the frogs covered the land. The third, dust turned into light, and each lice. And each time Moses was sent back to the Pharaoh saying, something worse is coming. Can you let the people go? And he would say no. And so swarms of flies came, and all the cattle in the land died. Boils became apparent on the bodies of men and women and beasts. Hailstones that flattened crops and killed people fell from the skies. Locusts that ate everything that was left standing after the hail. There was no food left. Thick darkness lasted for 3 days. Next slide. And the Pharaoh said no. Nothing was going to make him release the children of Israel. He refused God, and he refused them after each one of these plagues was released. God decided on one more plague. This plague is described in the great detail, if you want to read about it, in Exodus 12. The release of the 10th plague sets the stage for the Passover celebration for thousands of years to come. So here's how the story went. Moses knew that the 10th plague was going to be the death of the firstborn in every family, and the firstborn of all the cattle and all the forms of animal. So the Israelites were instructed to take a male lamb. It had to be under a year old, one lamb for each family or kin group. Everyone was to slaughter the lamb the same night. This is the same process that Jesus and the apostles are going through. Each family, next slide please, each family was to use the blood of the lamb to mark the doorposts of their house. This was the blood of the sacrificial lamb. They were also told to roast the lamb with fire and eat it, all the while being ready to depart from their homes. God said he would pass through the land and kill every firstborn male child and beast of the Egyptians, but would spare the firstborn males in all the houses whose doorposts were marked with the blood of the lamb. Through Moses, the Lord instructed the people that no one could have leaven or leavened bread in their house. It did happen that night as God had foretold. All the male firstborns in Egypt were slain, but the houses of the children of Israel were passed over. Hence the name Passover. Pharaoh finally relented and gave the Israelites permission to leave Egypt, and they departed immediately. And so no one had any leaven with them, and they ate unleavened bread for 7 days. which is to this day part of the Passover ritual. According to God's instructions, this escape and exodus from Egypt was celebrated every year after that in the form of the Passover feast. It became known as the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, usually a 7-day festival and celebration. So to review the Passover is a celebration of liberation from bondage into freedom. And it's also the celebration of God's promise of present and future liberation. I'm going to read that again because I feel like we're in some kind of similar situation in today's world. God promised, part of what they celebrate was God's promise of present and future liberation. The Passover feast celebrated what God had done and what he could do and will do. He would lead his people everlastingly into freedom. Now we're going to circle back to the Last Supper and tie all of this information together. Here we are again in the upper room at the table of the Last Supper, a festive occasion, so the disciples thought. There was much going on in the mind of Jesus and in his heart, knowing his time was short and he would be betrayed by Judas that night. In the Gospel of Matthew, we learn that Jesus was in a state of great anguish and sorrow. So imagine what it was like in that upper room at that dinner. Jesus was burdened. He knew what was coming upon him. He knew of the betrayal. He knew what the next few days were going to bring. And yet he's sitting there with his apostles who are dancing and singing and celebrating and just being lighthearted. Jesus had not yet surrendered to the will of God. He was in absolute torment. He would surrender after dinner in the Garden of Gethsemane. He would be betrayed by the kiss of Judas and arrested in a few short hours. In the morning, he would be tried and crucified in the afternoon. All of this was known to him. With the apostles around him still celebrating the traditional Passover, you can imagine the surprise, perhaps even the shock, when Jesus, the high priest and guru, unexpectedly gave new meaning to the ritual of communion with the bread and the wine. Next slide, please. We find the blessing of the unleavened bread and the wine in the Gospel of Mark. It reads, "And as they did eat, Jesus took bread and blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body.' And he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank of it. And he said unto them, 'This is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many. Verily I say unto you, I will drink no more of the fruit of the vine until that day that I drink it new in the kingdom of God.'" These words may sound familiar to us, but they had a tremendous impact on his disciples. The next slide we will slip by quickly and show after we're finished. So Jesus took the bread, the unleavened Passover bread, and associated it with his body, broken for many. Jesus became the bread, as he had said before, "I am the bread of life." And he took the cup of wine and he related it to his blood, which was shed for the redemption of the people. His blood, his sacred essence, the light energy of the Christ. Especially in the blood, we see the connection with the Passover lamb. The blood of the lamb was used to buy life and liberation for the children of Israel. So too is the spiritual essence of the blood of Christ. Jesus shared all that he was. He knew that the end of his mission had come, and he soon had to take his leave of his disciples. Before leaving this life, he left for us a gift, a new ritual of communion. Communion was now raised to a higher level where it contained the consciousness of the body and the blood of Christ. Each time that we receive communion, we put on an increment of Christ's consciousness. Like Melchizedek, Jesus, this ascended master in the making, had a gift that he had to deliver on that Holy Thursday so long ago, a gift that has been with us for 2,000 years. He laid down his life as the Passover lamb so that others could be infused and liberated by his light. The next slide, we're almost done. In anticipation of the coming Aquarian age, Jesus made violet flame available to devoted people in the sacrament of communion. Those who were devoted and sought to embody the mysteries of Christ would have the use of the violet flame for centuries before Saint Germain made it available to everyone in 1930. Can you imagine that entire 2,000-year period of time? People around the world were receiving the violet flame and taking it into their own being, not even knowing. Back in 1972, when Mark Prophet spoke of receiving communion, he said, "We will receive a spiritual transfusion." Now, many of us understand the consequences of a physical blood transfusion. So how much more stupendous is a spiritual transfusion? The celebration of communion is an ancient ritual used in the retreats of the Great White Brotherhood. Another incredible understanding to contemplate as you receive communion is that receiving the consecrated host, the bread, we are taking in not only the spiritual essence of the body of Jesus Christ, we are also taking in the body of all that God has ever created in all systems of worlds. And as we receive the consecrated wine, the grape juice, we're receiving the symbol of the life of God, the spirit that flows through everything and animates all things. When we are participating in a cosmic communion service, where we are communing with the one substance that is everywhere present in the universe, that comes from spirit. And so you have the three stories that weave together and brings forth, I hope, a greater understanding of the cosmic gift that you may participate in receiving communion whenever it is possible. And it is possible for each of us to receive communion every day. It was recommended by Mrs. Prophet that we do that. And in order to do it in the ashram ritual, there is a prayer towards the back of the booklet where you stand before the altar with the elements in your hands and you simply read this prayer. And there is an angel of the Eucharist who will stand there. And at the moment the consecration is established, she drops her hands over the elements, and fire out of the sun behind the sun travels the universe and descends into those elements and remains there, once blessed, always blessed. And so when you take that into your body, you are taking the essence of Almighty God. And for as long as those two elements remain in your body, going through your system, you are an outpost of the Great White Brotherhood. And everyone and everything around you is blessed. And that's it. I have, if you all want to hear it, I have just a few couple words on transubstantiation, which means the transforming of the elements of the bread and the wine. We believe that there is a blessing that takes place, comes out of the Son behind the Son. And there's an actual physical change that occurs in the elements during the blessing of the bread and the wine. In the consecration of the Eucharist, a direct link is established to the Lord Christ and beyond into the heart of God. At that time, the light of the Christ consciousness descends as a line of white fire into the elements. When observing consecration with the inner eye, one can see that the host actually glows with an inner brilliance, like the light of the sun and its corona. This manifestation is an extension of Christ's consciousness. Christ's light is present every time the Eucharist is celebrated, and we assimilate his consciousness through the bread and the wine each time we celebrate communion. So that would be all I can share with you at the moment.
Well, Kate, I just want to say that I wish we had told everyone to bring communion to this session
I thought
so
about
that
it.
we could take it right this moment.
Yeah.
It feels like a sacred moment, and that we have learned some very special things. And wow. How long is your video, Kate?
The one of the Last Supper is 11 minutes. This one from Jesus of Nazareth, that's the film production. They captured the emotion, the different emotions between the apostles and Jesus, and they captured the burden in the actor who played Jesus.
Why don't we give everybody a chance to show their appreciation to you, and then we'll watch the video for all who can remain. How's that?
Sure, or if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them.
All right, let's take 5 minutes for that if we need it, and then we'll watch the video.
Okay.
A lot of thank yous in the chat. Any questions, anyone?
I got one.
I have a question.
Yeah, not a question, just a profound thank you to Kate. That was just wonderful. You fitted so many pieces of the jigsaw into the jigsaw to be able to see the whole picture. It was just wonderful. Thank you, Kate. Thank you.
Thank you. And your last name happens to be the place where Abraham went.
That's right.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Okay, let me set up the video. This is the actual Last Supper. It begins in the room, door opens, and I think Peter, one of the apostles, comes through the door, and you will see the noise, the dancing, the celebration of Passover, which was the norm up to that time.
Wow.
Yeah.
All but 2 people stayed for that. Thank you so much, Kate. It was wonderful.
God is good. And what we consider a very small, insignificant part of our life to receive communion now is worthy of the understanding that we have. So thank you. Thank you for asking me to do this. I love all you guys.